that investigations of dance and focusing on the scientific understanding of human movement may lose sight of the very cultural specificity that makes some, but not all, of these movement patterns instantiate dances. And at least for my concerns with dance, this aspect is fundamental to any dance studies that deserves the name. So the place of humanistic understanding, both for appreciation and investigation of dance, is a major concern of mine in general and today. And those issues are not appropriately explained causally. In dance, as in a chess game, our concern is in dealing with right and wrong moves, better or worse moves, and these are not dimensions of the causal explanation characteristic of science. As Frege insightfully put it, error and superstition have causes as much as correct cognition. That is, both good works and responses and poor ones have causal stories. Given our concern with appreciating dance, we need the normative, not the causal. So a key factor here is that our topic is dance, which is, after all, a human activity, its identification and appreciation requiring a humanistic confection to accommodate, among other things, the normativity of dance appreciation. For fundamental here is the thought of better or worse, and that, as Frege's point implicitly recognises, distinguishes a concern with dance from a concern with human bodies in motion, even when these are confusable counterparts, and we could say more about that. I'll begin with a longish preamble to clarify the history of this material and to locate it within the larger canvas which I take my work to be a part. In 2012, I was invited to contribute to a special issue of the Journal of Aesthetics and Art Criticism, here it is, Jack, on the aesthetics of dance. I can only assume that I missed or misread one of the emails, because I thought we all had to write about the work of John Martin. Not my favourite John Martin with a Y, the dead folk singer, but my second favourite John Martin, the dead dance critic. Yet everyone else involved in the project seems to have thought that the volume was to focus on the relation of science to the study of dance, a topic that I've covered extensively in PAD, the Philosophical Aesthetics of Dance. Since my contribution was then too long for the volume, Jack included a much abbreviated version. Some of the other material, since I didn't want to waste it, together with some that is in Jack, is recrafted for today. I'd been happy to discuss John Martin's dance criticism, partly because it gave me an opportunity to address supposed dualism. Explaining that concern, however, takes us into the second aspect of this preamble, some personal reflections on the recent history of analytic philosophy. When I first studied philosophy, its centre was in the UK, with the later work of Wittgenstein at its pinnacle, and that of J.L. Austin in, as it were, second place. But Austin had died young, and Wittgenstein had died, as it were, intestate, without publishing any of this later work. As a result, the centre of analytic philosophy moved to the US, where its spearhead was expatriate Europeans, Carnap, Reichenbach, or their Americanized followers, Fiegel, Quine, who led ultimately to Davidson and others. The point, though, is that this tradition had become separated from the British tradition before the later interventions of Wittgenstein and of J.L. Austin. As a result, such names were rarely mentioned. Moreover, other mentions of their traditions, such as John Wisdom, Friedrich Waismann, Stuart Hampshire, were not mentioned at all, nor were they typically studied. Now, at least arguably, this bifurcation of the analytic tradition has resulted in the very different approaches within philosophy to causal explanation, and hence in what I regard as a misplaced emphasis on the brain. Thus, in the interview reprinted in his Origins of Analytic Philosophy, Michael Dummett dismisses as an outright mistake the strategy of treating the philosophy of thought as part of the philosophy of mind, commenting, and I quote, "If this means that the theory of meaning is really a theory of something very complicated that goes on in the brain, that's a completely unphilosophical way of looking at the matter. Philosophy," he says, "is not concerned with what enables us to speak as we do, but with what it is for our utterances to have the meanings that they have. And nothing that happens in the brain can explain that." While I do not in general agree with Dummett about theory of meaning, I think he's exactly right about that. Now, another disturbing consequence of the bifurcation of the analytic tradition that I just mentioned was that some arguments and conclusions I took for granted were no longer taken as obvious, and could not, with good part, because I could not, with good part, present as arguments of mine what were in fact something established previously within that tradition. For instance, Elizabeth Anscombe's demonstration that our knowing the position of our limbs, to the degree that we do, does not involve, nor require, a sensory modality, especially since when one checked the position of limbs, that checking typically took a form familiar to dancers, namely looking in the mirror, the very reason we feel dance studios are mirrors. So I felt sheepish about affirming what were not, after all, my insights, although I regarded them as demonstrated beyond contradiction. Moreover, I took for granted that philosophy was replete with attempts to explain the relationship of mind to body or something similar. This no doubt included mind-body dualism ascribed to Descartes, in line with the Cartesian legend, but also logical behaviorism, central state materialism, and a host of others. Thus I was surprised when my predecessor, David Best, another member of my tradition, took dualism to be especially problematic. But he convinced me of its relevance here, that it was pervasive within dance studies, at least at the time, hence it became one of my topics as it had been one of his. When I wrote the piece for Jack, my thought was that John Martin was a dualist only because, at the time he was writing, that seemed the obvious picture of the mind, but that his position in his criticism did not centrally depend on his dualism. Hence my piece as published was called Diffusing Dualism. I argued there that many of my non-dualist theses could be, or could have been, accepted by Martin without loss. For a number of claims, seemingly supported by talk of metakinesis or inner mimicry in Martin's writing, can be sustained without that theoretical structure. Moreover, that Martin might embrace these claims, I offered 6 of them. The possibility of accommodating these ideas within a sophisticated aesthetic of dance may remove the tendency to think of these as the sort of thing only dancers want to claim, which I would deny. In fact, a proper understanding of dance requires recognizing the distinctive role that dancers have in making concrete the dance work, but that role is independent of anything I'm going to say today. Of course, Martin sometimes writes as though recognizing or appreciating dance was, or involved, a modality of sense. But we're familiar with appeals to the sense of direction or the sense of humour as invocations of human powers and capacities. In that case, first, no distinctive sensory modality is involved. We see the amusing slapstick, we hear the one-liner, we read the comic novel, and that's a special case. So no particular sensory modality, just as we notice, however subliminally, whatever landmarks permit the sense of direction. Such cases involve the senses, no doubt, but there is no distinctive modality here. Then second, appeal is to a complex package of human powers and capacities. This too is similar to invoking a sense to explain the location of bodily motion, but whose, that would be a key question. In that here, there is no sense, no sensory modality. We depend here heavily on seeing the position in space of our bodies, hence the mirrors I mentioned before. Then sometimes Martin's claims may be read in better than dualistic ways. For instance, remarks reflecting the choreographer's intention or something similar refer to the human intentions as embodied in the performed works. That's how contemporary theorists read reference to intention. Theorists, that is represented by, say, Noel Carroll and by me. For we have set aside the conception of intention as prior planning in the head of the artist, at best causally connected to the work itself. One doesn't interrogate the artist's psyche, but looks instead to the dance itself properly understood. One is on a parallel, a poem reader, not a mind reader. For only a misconceived account of the relation of intention to art separates that intention from the artwork. Instead, one needs an account not stopping short of, but terminating on the work of art itself, as Volheim puts it. Thus, when Martin tells us that the artist's purpose is to arouse us to feel a certain emotion about a particular object or situation, we should ask whether, on his account, that emotion is at best causally related to the artwork itself. If it is, the account would be dualistic in the ways criticised earlier, but that account may well just reflect the artist's intention as embodied in the dance work. In such a world, how have we access to what might seem like the choreographer's psychological state? rejecting dualist pictures of intention will be one precondition of our doing so. So Martin simply recognises this human power, in the artistic case, the force of a person behind artistic creation, reflecting thinking traditionally considered as the artist's intention. But Martin must also explain how what he claimed was there could be recognised in the dance and in this performance of it, and valuable in those circumstances, recognised first by him and later by a suitably informed and suitably sensitive audience. He was keen to deny the purely intellectual element of such a claim, since the outcome must necessarily be integral to one's appreciation of the dance work. Knowledge alone cannot be sufficient. Audience members cannot require, for their appreciation of this dance work, sophisticated knowledge of the history of dance, the sort of thing dance history classes offer, since such knowledge by itself cannot generate artistic understanding. Rather, the audience's appreciation of the bodily movement must be manifest, even if that appreciation grew from seeing the dance. So Martin drew on a line from new criticism of literature, that one need only scrutinise the dance itself to understand it, whether that scrutiny may involve recognising it as dance and of a certain kind. Further, dance understanding could not be forever unavailable to an audience willing to make appropriate efforts, for instance, one educated through attention to Martin's reviews. For clearly artistic appreciation requires more than a perfectly functioning neuromuscular system and an equally healthy general physical organism, that's Martin. One must say see the red patch in the painting depicting the cottage roof, but one must also see the cottage and recognise that painting as balanced where the balance is achieved by the red patch. That is, one must recognise the artistic properties of the artwork, and the same is true of the dances. Indeed, Martin makes this point in urging that for dance appreciation. It's necessary to appreciate the stuff of which dance is made, this is Martin, namely the movements of the human body, but also to appreciate form, or the arrangement of this essential material of movement into such sequences and relationships that it assumes significance for the onlooker, and he goes on to mention also style. Such features cannot be grasped by inner mimicry, so doing justice to Martin's insight here requires stressing additional and more traditional conceptual aesthetics. That in turn puts pressure on the importance he gives to inner mimicry, but other views of the mechanism of perception of dance. Let's see some of this. If I fall down, by the way, it won't be wine, it'll be jet lag. Moreover, this account of Martin's reflects Frege's dictum. It's intentional rather than causal. For the issue here is not simply perception. Instead, one confronts a difficulty Martin had in writing as a dance critic, that one requires training to appreciate the movement in dance. With your perceptual apparatus functioning correctly, you may still fail to see the dance as dance, still less to appreciate it as dance. You can know that such and such is a dance, but as Wisdom remarked, parrots may not know it, and yet perhaps they have an even better eyesight than yours. The visual acuity thereby granted to the parrot does not allow her to see dance, or better, to recognise dance when she sees it. Your capacities exceeding those of the parrot may be explained by your mastery of concepts, of relevant concepts, your sensitivity to differences between what is dance and what just resembles it, between good and better dances, and so on. Differences we recognise as cultural and evaluative, and beyond the scope of the parrot. In fact, an earlier version of this presentation was entitled Parrots in the Front Row and Macaques in the Second, a plan for performance space for dance. Moreover, Martin was typically aware of this. Indeed, through his criticism, one can learn to see dance as dance, and hence learn to appreciate it as dance. For with a few other pioneers, such as Mary Watkins, Martin was literally inventing the role of dance critic as we know it, and in doing so, stressing at least two roles central to dance criticism: that of consumer guide and of maker of taste. Under the first aspect, consumer guide, the audience was advised of the value, or otherwise particular performances currently on offer, to generate audiences here rather than there. Under the second aspect, the maker of taste, Martin sought to lead audiences to value what he saw as valuable in much modern dance, in particular in the dances of Martha Graham. For Martin, This task was partly educational. As Selma Jean Cohen noted, the audience was required to widen its perceptions away from the familiar from ballet. Since the role of the dance critic was comparatively new and not easily characterized in words, Martin should be forgiven if some of his comments seem confusing or even naive, for his main target was to show that there was indeed a role to be fulfilled, and that capacity is more easily located in our conceptual mastery and in our cultural assimilations. In some moods, Martin follows this line, writing of the interchange between artist and layman, or comparing dance to music as, quote, a recognised part of our cultural life. Moreover, Martin rightly grants the logical importance of an audience by stressing the centrality for art of communication. That, and I quote, with the desire for communication, there comes the beginning of art, and in writing of communication which art demands. So on Martin's project, unlike, say, Barbara Montero's Aesthetic for Dancers, the audience for dance, roughly the audience for Martin's reviews, comes to understand dances seen in performance. Since Martin's target is an account of the audience for dance, metakinesis cannot be a property for dancers only, but must operate in general audiences for dance works. But that too speaks against treating it as a sensory modality, as sixth sense. Now, careful attention here should, though it regularly does not, lead us away from that evidential view of perception captured by talk of evidence of the senses. No doubt trotter prints in the butter are evidence of a pig in the kitchen. But notice first, not evidence of trotter prints, just see those, and second, not evidence of a pig when we're actually seeing the pig. Yet could not our bodily reactions, our toe tappings and sitting up straighter, and holding our breath and tensing our legs and so on, in some small way play into our appreciation of dance? This is precisely what makes no sense, what Best's prohibition on dualism prescribes. Of course, one might agree with Wittgenstein that, for an outsider, my tapping my toe and so on might, in certain contexts, be evidence that I understood the dance. That behaviour might be taken, in context, to indicate understanding. Yet it can be indicative only because the understanding itself is independent of those responses. And of course, this would not be how I understood the dance, as though I might conclude from studying my behaviour that, since I was doing those things, I must understand that dance. Further, when writing that piece for Jack, I also discerned another tendency in Martin, which I didn't discuss there, namely a kind of scientism. I want to discuss that combination of scientism and dualism today, since, as I see it, it militates against Martin's overall project in dance appreciation, or more specifically, dance criticism. That is to say, unless he's careful, he's going to be sucked into causal explanation and not normative explanation. My plan here contrasts Martin's work, which I just discussed, with some more recent projects from Barbara Montero. While both could be treated as dualist and dismissed as such, Montero's are more essentially or damagingly so, but for each, their scientism is more damaging insofar as the aim was to understand the appreciation of dance, not other facts about it. What's Montero trying to study here in, for instance, the use of the experiments of Calvo Marino et al.? Well, in intention, the original study is a three-way comparison of people seeing capoeira, Brazilian martial art, and ballet, with expert groups for each activity drawn from practitioners, plus a control group. But for those concerned with the review of motor perception, that characterization already concedes one key point, that the perceptual modality here is the investigation of the visual. Subjects were asked to give attention to looking and seeing. Now, there are dualist assumptions at the heart of the experimental protocols here, but I shall assume my earlier discussion allows us to put them aside. Yet fundamental points about the nature of investigations arise here. For instance, it's important, to my way of thinking, that one cannot study people seeing an activity unless one's research protocol involves looking at people actually engaged in that activity. In this case, in people seeing when we're looking at that activity. But the designs to which Montero refers approvingly have the subjects looking at videos of the respective activities. This can only be relevant if either one simply assumes that the differences between comparative groups cancel out, so the flaw in the protocol applies equally to all, and hence can be set aside, or that seeing the video or film does not, after all, differ importantly from seeing the actual activity. Well, only the second of these claims has any plausibility at all. Even it just seems an improbable claim, as consideration for parallel suggests. After all, many sports fans would prefer to see their preferred activity live to seeing it on television or video. But why? Well, because they recognise sets of differences here. Our thought then is that in some way, seeing the activity on film or video is not the same as seeing that activity. That saying one is looking at a depiction is granting some differences here. Now clearly there are important limits in what one can learn about dance or dance work by watching only videos or film of dance as opposed to dance performances. In this respect, we might resemble those art historians Volheim mentions, who identify the object of their inquiry with the properties of a painting which a good slide preserves. It is, I assume, a commonplace or default position among aestheticians of dance that, at the least, the importance of the performance of dance should be preserved, and that default is part of our explanation of dance works as performables. But when we turn to the experimental research under consideration, to what extent are we willing to give up or modify that default position? That is, to what extent will we insist on the crucially different character of watching the actual dance as opposed to watching just the dance on film or video? To repeat, the logical point here is that one cannot study X without one's research design addressing X. But a response here might suggest that what is addressed, namely depictions of the action, amount, for research purposes, to the very same thing. I do not see how to make this out. It's not obviously the same thing for, say, filming lions, but it certainly stimulates discussion of the relation of dance performances to the dance on film, in a favoured case, that is, in what I should call direct filming, to introduce assumptions about its transparency. Note in passing that the discussion I'm going to introduce here has a bearing on a more commonplace issue, the status of dance on film. Hence a key topic here should be thinking about the direct filming of dance performance with the least intervention of the filming process. How close can this get to watching dance, even in favoured cases? For some of the cases discussed, especially in experiments, treat watching the film as equivalent to seeing the dance, and for other activities, mutatis mutandis. Now, I have reservations about the degree to which seeing the film ever counts as completely equivalent to seeing the dance performance, even in the most favoured case. As Arlene Croce puts it, magnetic tape is making us indifferent to the actual moment of an event. It is destroying the art of performance. Compare here Caruso singing a role in an opera with the case of Mario Lanza. From film, we might mistakenly think that Lanza could have performed the whole opera, or perhaps on more than one night. True. Further, many dance works are, at least typically, presented to their audience in ways that recognise the specifics of that audience, in the round or through a proscenium arch or whatever. Hence, for them at least, actually seeing the dance works typically differs fundamentally from seeing their depiction. That is, there's, for example, a preferred set of views of the dance work, so not just any view will do. And an expert audience for dance might be expected to understand this in ways the other groups would not. Hence, it's odd to think of a neutral view here. That is one of the many places one would expect knowledge of dances to bear on one's perception of dance. No doubt there are parallel cases for capoeira and other activities. Hence, these are cases where what earlier I called direct filming is not appropriate. We should conclude that the research protocols here do not and could not address their ostensible topic in actual behaviour, since they attend only to the depiction of that behaviour on film. Speaking metaphorically, here I would stress the immediacy of dance, that it's that, rather than say its ephemerality, which explains my concern with dance performance, as opposed to, for instance, seeing the dance on film or video. But these cases need not really differ, since both stress the differences between this performance and the next. So, let's say, immediacy and ephemerality need not differ that much. Of course, one need not know about past performances, the kind of knowledge dance history might offer, to know that this one, in the here and now, is distinctive to at least some degree. Perhaps, at least sometimes, some other performances could not be clearly distinguished from this one, given the high level of training and craft mastery of the dancers. But still, the edge of this performance, tonight, lies in the numerous ways it could have gone hopelessly wrong, even if it never did, and even if others never went hopelessly wrong either. For the immediacy here rests on the sense in which the performance of today had to be delivered today, within the constraints of today's situation. So for me, what the filming misses is not something about, say, metakinesis or something similar. Thus, we might usefully begin with the positive dimensions of such a case. For me, we can, in principle, see the choreographer's intention as embodied in today's performance, in the performance today of these dancers, and much of their craft knowledge of dances is also visible in respect of this dance, much as we might in a trouble-free idealization of an actual performance. That's why, in practice, the dance critic of today would typically begin building his or her audience, the ones who in Martin's picture will learn to understand dance, by considering the dance on film or video, preferably in what earlier I called direct filming. For many features the critic hopes to bring to the audience's attention will be visible in that filming. And of course, one can re-watch the film, allowing the clear identification and discussion of such features. Should the counterthought turn and say metakinetic rays from performance to audience member, that superstition would clearly be undermined by the absence of an actual person as performed here. It was only the persons on film, and surely such rays will need a person as origin. That is, only the causality of your seeing as audience and hearing the film can be invoked. But because we know we're seeing in some other person, that is because we take the filming to be transparent, either in reality or as part of our assumption about direct filming, perhaps some of our responses to genuine persons can be imported into this situation. Hence, perhaps this film can be seen as though it were a performance, even while recognizing that the mechanics of filmmaking preclude the literal truth of that thought. It's not a performance anymore, even if that's where it began. Notice how the possibility of making something of the film suggests either, like my view, that some features of the dance can be recognized through the filming, engaged primarily via the normal projective sensory modalities of sight and hearing, or by contrast, that these are not features of the dance at all, but features we, as audience, project onto it. No enthusiast of dance could endorse that view. Moreover, it's clear that one can appreciate something of the dance in that case, even if only something, enough so that if you ask me how I spent Tuesday afternoon, I should of course say I was watching that dance, even though I was only watching the film. Obviously, I was not doing anything else. More specifically, I was not watching anything else, unless one counts the answer watching the dance on film. But I could also, with some justice, say that I was appreciating the dance, for many or most of the comments I produced as a result of that afternoon's activity accurately reflect features of the dance work, at least in a favourite case. In that sense, seeing the film is clearly seeing something relevant, but not, of course, seeing the dance. Thus, we would rightly censure the dance critic who wrote his or her reviews simply on the basis of that film alone. But our criticism will be less harsh for such a person who watched the film than for a critic who just made up his review. And that's a key philosophical point about occasion sensitivity. Would Martin have disputed this focus on seeing the dance performance? Something said for seeing the film. I cannot see why he should, although perhaps he would have had difficulty visualizing it, since the technological resources early in his career were vastly more limited than those of today. Like me, he thought that what was at issue were features of the dance, features available to perception by a suitably informed and suitably sensitive audience, the kind of audience possibly created by reading his Martin's works. So the right film might be idealized as preserving, well, as many of those features as possible, if not all. And these were ordinarily perceptible features, the relationship of this dancer to that one, the dependence in its lift of the one on the other, and so on. Such comments might seem to support, or anyway to accord with, the use of images of dance and of capoeira in, say, the fMRI studies of Calvo Marina et al., as reported by Montero and others. But as noted earlier, the experiments are standardly described as though the experimental subjects were shown actual dance or actual capoeira. So on a casual reading, these experiments seem to involve genuine perception of persons in motion. But this is false. Hence my line of reasoning does nothing to support such a conception. Instead, these experiments misconceive the relation of what is seen to the action itself, or rather, the protocol mistakenly assumes that there are no important differences here between seeing the dance and seeing its depiction on film, perhaps because of assumed similarities in what strikes the retina. In these experiments, at best, the subjects respond not to events, but to images of them, as though these were equivalent, as though we could not tell them apart. And the analysis treats them as equivalent. The real history of the philosophy of perception, the one flowing through J.L. Austin in the line I mentioned earlier, distinguishes seeing a person from seeing a depiction of that person on the assumption that, at least usually, and hence feasibly, these can actually be distinguished in practice. Indeed, the standard response to the starting point of much philosophy of perception in the argument from illusion falls down here, as though, when looking at a straight stick immersed in water, we do not notice the water. And even in more artificial cases, any mistakes we make here as to what we are perceiving can typically be pointed out and rectified. Further, and crucially, perception is a property of persons, not eyes, brains, and so on, even if eyes seem a precondition for seeing. So there's a limit to what story about eyes and brains can really tell us here. No doubt that causal substrate is important, but it will not help us distinguish seeing the ringer, as Charles Travis calls it, from veridical perception. But that does not mean that we cannot do it. What can we really learn about our perception of, for instance, dances, for our perception of depictions of dances, say on film and video? Only a strong, special and very strong view of the transparency of the photographic process seems to make even vaguely plausible the suggestion that one should learn much by comparing such cases. And certainly, such a view of transparency for photography does not seem defensible across the board. The confusion comes, of course, because advocates of research protocols of this sort imagine that at some brute empirical level there's no difference, that say the very same light rays strike the retina of subjects in both cases of real perception and the perception of depictions. So there's no room for such differences in what is seen, but this is at best simply an assumption, and one that conflicts with our common sense recognition that we can typically tell the one from the other. However, passivity of perception in this way is another key and contestable assumption of this kind of experimentation. The assumption seems to be that watching a real action and watching a depiction of an action, say on film, are equivalent. Yet we know this is false in at least two cases. First, as earlier, we typically do not mistake the depiction for the event. We do not confuse the murder depicted on television with the one some unfortunate might see, witness, on a closed-circuit TV camera. Indeed, context plays into the story yet more crucially. We do not typically confuse the murder depicted in a play with the real murder, and here there is no mediating technology. Further, the experimenters do not attempt to trick their subjects as to what is going on, nor express the desire to do this where practically feasible. So they don't say, you're really seeing dances now, they point out that this is dance on film. They seem content to ignore what their subjects know is taking place as though it were irrelevant. Yet second, we recognise that human perception is typically concept involving, and it's regularly concept mediated. That seeing a tree involves the capacity to recognise trees, and hence mastery to some degree of the concept tree. Then our perceptual range can be modified by acquiring a yet more refined conceptual repertoire, say mastery of the concepts ash, elm, oak, such that I can see elms and oaks when you can only see trees more generically. All of these are excluded from the picture common in psychology, which reduces perception to something shared by the case where I can distinguish elms from oaks and the case where I'm only master of the concept tree. And again, that need have nothing to do with the patterns of light and shade on the retina, which need not differ relevantly. In thus reflecting our concepts and the context of application, human perception is not entirely passive. In a recent paper, Dustin Stokes asked whether perception, especially artistic perception, is what he calls cognitively penetrable. That is, I quote, whether there are instances where two perceivers, in virtue of distinct background beliefs, visibly perceive the same object as distinct, say in size and colour. Here Stokes remarked on, and I quote, common sense intuition that how one sees or hears or otherwise perceives artworks, and I would add such as dances, is pervasively affected by what one knows, believes, or values about artworks. Like many aestheticians, he addresses this issue through a version of Walton's categories of art. such that persons with different beliefs and so on may see paintings differently or hear musical works differently for this reason. So it seems that at least artistic perception, the perception of artworks as artworks, will be cognitively penetrable, in the sense of two people could differ about it in virtue of what they knew or believed. Certainly artistic perception is intentional. Thus when a person looks at the Cubist painting or listens to the atonal music, if he or she fails to recognise them as respectively Cubist and atonal, he or she misperceives. He sees them as what they are not. So this seems a situation not well captured by thinking about cognitive penetration, since one of the views is ultimately sustainable, the other being false. It's not there were two alternative views. In this case, one of them is right, one of them is wrong. This fact returns us to the need for a person-centred approach to make sense of, in our case, plants. Since much writing on psychology refers to processing, say in the context of information processing and perception, it's worth commenting on this language of processing. Now, my body is certainly capable of processing a fair amount of beer, turning into the urine, perhaps other gases, as well as its contribution to my middle-aged spleen. This is an automatic process or set-off, but its very automatic quality questions its relation to the decisions and choices of appreciation. It could have little or nothing to do with my ability to understand or make sense of, in this case, dancing. The first is bodily in the way that the second is not, even though I am just this body, this anatomy and physiology. And Martin, too, was keen to identify the irrelevance to his interpretive project of what is automatic in this way, commenting that, quote, if a man made no more active response to art than the table to sunlight, he would experience no more reaction, for the table's response is passive and automatic. Of course, I'm not claiming that in every case, for all purposes, looking at the film differs from looking at the dance. Still, there's room for discussion here, especially once we recognise a set of cases where whether this is so seems a reasonable question to ask, but where the question of whether there is a justifiable difference in this context fails to be asked, despite some obvious differences of the kind of identified. To repeat, my point here is not, or not supposed to be, subtle. It says only that moves typical of the psychology of perception ignore facts from which such an investigation should really begin. If perception is not recognised as a human power, one will simply begin from the causal substrate, which as a materialist, I accept underlies such human processes. But saying that is precisely not to grant that causal perspective as one needed for the philosophically revealing investigation of the perceptual factors of humans. And of course, once we remove that assumption, it becomes very hard to set up the fMRI studies required or imagined, say by Barbara Montero. At their heart, the assumption concerned what was involved in studying cases of my seeing X, seeing so and so. But it turns out that in none of the cases is that actually investigated, since all the experimentation concerns depictions of events. That, of course, is scientistic. It's not studying what's claimed. Thank you.